Okay, I'm here with Jason England, and we've got him here talking to Genii readers about a feature specifically in the April issue about Jonathan Green, the reformed gambler. We had an amazing story come in through the transom at Genii by Paul Heller, which was really an Americana story about Jonathan Green, who was a gambler, a reformed gambler. He was a figure in American literature and American history. And the story of Green is an amazing one. And it's also a story that's significant to magicians for a number of reasons, for a number of really significant reasons. So when this happened, I just have to say that one of the nicest things that can happen when you're kind of sniffing around in stories that are slightly obscure like this, where the pieces don't quite come together, is to have someone tap you on the shoulder and say, oh, maybe I can explain how a couple of those things fit together. And if that person is Jason England, with his knowledge of gambling and cards and sleight of hand and historical subjects, that's about as good as that gets. So we put in a call to Jason and said, would you care to write a little bit about this for our magic audience? And he did an amazing sidebar, which you see in the April issue, tying all this together. And then we also got some amazing materials from Lee Asher about the history of playing cards to illustrate it. And so it's a really fascinating piece. And if you don't know the name Jonathan Green, I'm not terribly surprised, because it's a kind of obscure name in the world of magic, but it shouldn't be. And fortunately, Jason will explain that to us. So Jonathan Green, I mean, I know that was an interesting subject to you, although maybe not your first interest, a little bit obscure. How did you find all that and put all those pieces together?
So I've known of Green for, probably 20 years or so. He is an important figure in early American gambling writing. He is the first person to mention cheating at poker in the first edition of his first book, which was called An Exposure of the Arts and Miseries of Gambling. Came out in 1843, went through multiple printings, many printings, maybe a dozen. I'm not entirely sure how many printings that book went through.
They were really popular books, weren't they?
Very popular book. I don't have a first edition Green because they're not rare in bookseller terms, but they are uncommon. If you wanted one, probably take you a month to track one down. You'd spend $2,000 or $3,000 to get a hold of it. But I have a fourth edition of his book here. This is An Exposure of the Arts and Miseries of Gambling, or just Miseries of Gambling is all that's on the spine here. And this is the first book to mention cheating at poker. Again, first edition, 1843. It's not the first book to mention poker. That's about 5 years earlier in a book called Dragoon Campaigns to the Rocky Mountains, written by a guy named Hildreth. But Hildreth just sort of mentions the game in passing, like, oh, and the fellas on the trail were playing this new game, poker. That's all he says. And then Green comes along just 5 years later and talks about, well, yes, but it was a cheating game almost from the word go. And here's all the different methods that you can cheat at it. And in fact, that's so early that poker wasn't even in Hoyle yet. And remember, Hoyle was 200 years old by this time. Hoyle had been around for a while, his series of books. And poker doesn't get mentioned until 1845 in Hoyle. And in this little bitty edition right here, which is not much bigger than a playing card, actually. It's a very small book, but that's the Anner's edition of Hoyle, the first time poker is mentioned in Hoyle. So very new game, but Green, between Hildreth in Dragoon Campaigns and Green in Arts and Miseries, clearly establishes that poker was a game popular enough to get written about in the late 1830s, early 1840s, possibly even a little earlier than that. But the documentation gets a little slim, but yeah. So Green was sort of the first, at least in English, that we're aware of the reformed gamblers, and these are gamblers that had been making a living gambling, and then for whatever reason decided to change their tune and start preaching against gambling, which they did. And I was never all that interested in Green because he's a temperance author. And I don't like having to sift through thou shalt not gamble because God says so. I'm more interested in the technique.
Moralizing, yeah.
I want to know the raw information, how they were doing things. And so for a long time, I just wasn't hot on Green. I had one of his books. I had read it. But when you guys asked for this article, it really made me dig into his writings a little better. And I actually wound up reading books of his online that I didn't even have physical copies of. And now I have a much better, a much deeper appreciation for what Green was able to accomplish back then. Even though he had different goals, he still gives us a lot of early sources for things.
Right.
He mentions second dealing. The first known description of a strike second deal in English, published in America, is right there in his book. And he also mentioned stripper decks, a couple different kinds of stripper decks in his book, including the standard wedge stripper deck that we're familiar with today. He mentions that.
So while we're talking about games and while we're talking about Green's specialties, what he wrote about and what he was known for, can you tell us a little about thimble rigging? Thimble rigging is very mysterious to me. And am I right in saying that's the three shell game? It's not really the three shell game, but it's pretty close, isn't it?
Conceptually, it is.
Okay.
Yes. So it's it's the three shell game without walnut shells. They just using thimbles. I don't know if the three shell game with walnut shells would predate thimble rigging or the other way around.
Right.
But yes, conceptually, it's the same thing. Three little covers, a pea of some sort, and move them around and try to find the pea kind of thing. So
right.
yes,
and this is kind of this is what he was known for at a certain time in his career.
Certainly one of the things he was known for that he writes about. And he writes about thimble rigging, and he mentions another person in his books. I'm blanking on the name right now, but it's actually in the article.
That's right.
Submitted to Genii. He writes about this other personality who was sort of the king of thimble rigging at that time. So Green does write about him.
Yeah, and again, that it's a game you can't win.
Correct. Well, yeah, I mean, Ricky Jay made the point in one of his KCRW radio spots that it's not even a game. It's a con dressed up as a game. You have no chance to win, because even if you were to stumble upon the right thimble, they're just not going to pay you. They'll come up with some excuse not to pay you. So I've jokingly said before, and so have other people, that same with three-card Monte, we could play three-card Monte with the cards face up, and you're still not going to get paid, so not much of a game there. Right.
When gambling games were rough and ready.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So you make an amazing connection in your piece between how this all comes together, a kind of, link, the dominoes falling from one to the other, of how this guy Green, who, is previously maybe a literary figure or in the world of gambling, suddenly is now kind of front and center in our magic world.
A little bit, yeah. So first of all, Green was a lecturer. He traveled all around lecturing on the evils of gambling. Mm-hmm. And probably to drive home his lectures, he would do something that wasn't completely honest. He took a claim, a claim that had an element of truth to it, but he exaggerated the claim. So the claim that Green had is that every single deck of cards sold in America at that time, in the mid 1800s, was factory marked. Right. Okay, that is not true.
Yeah, an amazing conspiracy theory.
But there's a grain of truth to it.
Okay,
all of the American makers of that time period. Take Thomas Krehor, for instance, who I believe was a Boston area maker. Mm-hmm. Thomas Krehor, making cards in the mid 1800s, he had his back design, maybe more than one, but he had a Krehor back design. And gamblers would get some other printer to print a facsimile of the Krehor back, but secretly marked. Okay. So it's true that there were factory marked decks that looked like regular decks. That part is absolutely true. But what Green did is he exaggerated that point a little bit by saying that they're all marked that way.
Mhm.
That part's not true. Okay. Just like you and I could probably rummage around in a junk drawer and come up with a factory marked bicycle deck. That doesn't mean they're all marked, you
Right.
know. And so, but by doing so, by telling the people that they were all marked, I'm sure he frightened some people away from gambling, and that was his goal. But what's interesting is that he would often in his lectures send someone out of the hall, out of the lecture hall, run down the street to the stationery store to buy a deck of cards and bring it to him, shuffle it up and hand it to him. And he would, I've got a deck of cards right here, oddly enough.
Okay.
He would take that deck of cards and he would hold a card up and he would, announce whatever it was. He would announce 5 of hearts. And then he would hold the next one up and he would announce 2 of hearts.
Right.
What he was doing was using a hidden mirror in his table or lectern to just catch a reflection of it, and then he would pretend to read the back design. So he was cheating at his cheating expose. And what's interesting about that is that became a card trick. So in the 1930s, Ralph Hull, I'm going to read something to you here.
Sure.
In the 1930s, Ralph Hull, who we've all heard about, an early American 20th century author, in More Eye Openers, Impromptu Card Tricks for Parlor, Club, or Stage, 1933. He writes, he has a trick in here called Any Deck Read from the Card Backs. And he writes, here's a trick I have performed for 20 years. And because I have not found it to be generally known amongst amateur and professional magicians, I am including it in this series. Is it true that any deck can be read from the backs of the cards? I do not know to whom credit for this unique feat belongs. Well, I do. It belongs to Jonathan Harrington Green, who wasn't even trying to do a card trick. He was trying to drive home a point.
Right.
But here, in 1933, from mid 40s, 80 years later, right. Ralph Hull's doing this as a card trick. We still do it to this day as card tricks, especially those of us that do gambling material. I'll often take someone's deck and go, these are marked, and either right. peek at a card or get a little bit ahead of them and pretend to read some marks and then hand it back to them. But I'm doing it tongue in cheek, and the person I do that to almost always realizes that they just saw a card trick. They didn't see an actual demonstration. But Green did it as an actual demonstration and inadvertently created a card trick.
Interesting. Wow.
And he also was the first person to combine gambling expose writing with magic tricks. So this book is an 1868 Dick and Fitzgerald reprint of his book. They called it Gambler's Tricks with Cards. It actually has a slightly longer title than that in its first edition form. Plenty of gambling books before this one. Right. Plenty of magic books before this one. But this is the first book to combine gambling expose stuff and card tricks, at least as far as I'm aware.
Right.
And so, this is 50-something years before Erdnase, who does the same thing. If you remember in the Expert at the Card Table, in the preface to the Expert at the Card Table, Erdnase rants a little bit about the mealy-mouthed pretensions of piety. You can tell that he didn't care so much for the temperance writing. He was interested in the raw moves, the raw techniques, and how they did it. Same as me.
Right.
And so he kind of takes a shot at these reformed gamblers. And I've always believed, although I can't prove this, I've always believed that he was taking a shot directly at Green, because he talks about the reformed gamblers. And Jonathan Harrington Green billed himself as the reformed gambler, not a reformed gambler, but the reformed gambler.
Right.
So I think Erdnase was taking a shot at Green a little bit. I think it's only speculation, but I think it's very plausible that Erdnase's book leans in a certain direction away from temperance and into technique. He's leaning into the moves and the technique and how to do it, as opposed to why not to do it, which is, Green and Quinn and all the different temperance reformed gambler writers before him.
Right.
So I think it's reasonable to make a case that Green affected Erdnase.
Yeah.
And we know Erdnase affected Vernon. So without Green, Do we get the Erdnase that we got in 1902? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe it colored sort of the approach that he took to some degree. And
Right.
without Erdnase, do we get the Vernon that we got?
Right.
Again, who knows? We know how much that book affected him. We know how much that book gave him entree into the New York card scene in the late 19 teens and into the 1920s. So it's impossible to know for sure, but it is very likely that Green affected us today through Erdnase and through Vernon.
Yeah, that's a real straight line there. Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's amazing. Yeah.
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 I don't have hard proof of it, but I mean, all the pieces are there.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
Now, it's a great story. It's a really interesting story that's it's been there all the time. I mean, I because I knew Ricky Jay, Green was a character in Ricky's pantheon of characters, for various reasons.
Yep.
So I used to hear him talk a little bit about Green, but even to me, it was, he was a slightly mysterious character because it was all through layers of Americana and literature,
Sure.
and those connections are interesting, and they're not obvious to you until you put it together like that in terms of
Right.
all the combinations.
Yeah, I went to Ricky's house one time,
Mhm.
and I was very fortunate to get a tour from him of his collection. And I'll never forget a phrase that he said to me, because he asked me, he said, "What are you interested in?" And I said, "Well, I'm interested in gambling and cheating, and I'm interested in card magic, primarily close-up card magic, stage card magic, not as much."
Right.
And he said, "Okay." Well, he goes, "Well, I've got a lot of both of those." And he points to his shelf of Green, which was this long,
Right.
and he goes, "As you can see, I'm strong in Green." And that was his way of saying, "I have a solid Jonathan Harrington Green collection here." And he was strong in Green. He had one of everything, multiple copies of some things, and all in terrific shape.
Yeah.
So Ricky was certainly an expert on Jonathan Harrington Green. And to be honest, I didn't appreciate Green at that time. I knew of him. I knew that he had written the early books, but the temperance stuff just kept me from really diving deep into his writings. And you guys asking me to write this sidebar for this article is what fixed all of that, because now I had to read a little bit more about Green to dig up some things. And what I realized is that I had not given Green enough credit for the really early stuff that's in his book. I mean, early mentions of the strike second deal, different types of stripper decks, explanations of cheating at Faro and things of that nature. So much early stuff traces back through him. Now, he didn't invent it, but he's cataloging it for the period. And so really, really important guy in early gambling, and therefore early magic / gambling expose work for sure.
No, it's a great story, and I appreciate you diving into this with us on short notice, putting these pieces together. If you guys have a chance, I hope you've had a chance to meet Jason, talk to him a little bit about sleight of hand and certainly, gambling history. And best of all is if you ever get a chance to sit down and watch him perform, because that's kind of where all the pieces come together and you begin to realize how all this influence has created this kind of rarefied ability. So I've had a chance to see that. It's amazing. And I would urge our readers and watchers to go out of your way to get a chance to see Jason apply his trade when it comes to magic, because it's a
Thank you very much for that.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for helping us again, and we'll see you back in the pages of Genii at some point. We've got some scheme to get you back and contribute again. I know, but we'll do our best. Thanks, Jason.
Understood. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.